Hello viewers, today we will discuss about global monitoring of population. Today, the world's population is approximately 6.7 billion and increasing rapidly despite a recent decline in the overall rates of population growth. Population growth is distinctively uneven worldwide, and these differences are reflected in the allocation and the use of resources. An overview of population growth processes, surveys, and recent trends in population statistics, including fertility, contraception, sex ratios, nutrition, HIV/AIDS, urbanization, aging, migration, income distribution, consumption, and biocapacity is put forth here. Also, current population trends are indicators of the near future, providing a basis for ongoing attention and research on population issues. Adolescence is the period of transition between childhood and adulthood. Adolescence is considered to begin with puberty, a process of physical, psychological, and emotional development triggered by a cascade of endocrine changes which lead to maturation and reproductive capability. Among both girls and boys, the start of puberty can vary by 4 or 5 years around the mean. Although puberty generally lasts 2 to 4 years, there is no strict definition of when adolescence begins and ends. In many societies, adolescents and young people are expected to remain in school for long periods, and legal provisions set the age of maturity generally at age 18 or higher. Therefore, one approach to determining the period of adolescence would be to focus on persons aged 12 to 17 years. Similarly, there is no established definition of youth. In preparing for the first International Youth Year in 1985, however, the report of the Advisory Committee for the International Youth Year noted the following: a chronological definition of who is young as opposed to who is a child or who is an adult varies with each nation and culture. However, the United Nations for statistical purposes defines those persons between the age of 15 and 24 as youth, without prejudice to other definitions by member states. The use of 15 as the lower bound for youth instead of 18 was indeed driven by statistical considerations, since data are very often available only in terms of age groups that span 5 years. In recent practice, studies on adolescents and youth have defined those groups flexibly. The main focus is to present report is on young people aged 12 to 24, but the term adolescents and youth will refer to varying age groups owing to data limitations. Among the 1.6 billion persons aged 12 to 24 in 2012, 0.89 billion are aged 18 to 24. The overall number of adolescents and youth is expected to change little over the coming decade, and provided that the fertility, the mortality levels in developing countries continue to decline, may relatively remain stable over the rest of the century. The population aged 12 to 24 is still increasing rapidly in Africa, however, while it is declining or will soon decline in all other regions. Consequently, the proportion of the world's adolescents and youth living in Africa is expected to rise from 18% in 2012 to 28% by 2040, while the shares of all other regions will decline. The region comprising Asia and the Pacific is expected to experience the sharpest decline, from 61% in 2012 to 52% by 2040. Most adolescents and youth live in a different world from that in which their parents grew up. Compared to young people 20 years ago, adolescents in 2012 are healthier and more likely to spend their adolescence in school, to postpone entry into the labor force, and to delay marriage and childbearing. Because change is not happening at the same pace everywhere, however, there are also growing disparities among adolescents and youth within and across countries. In particular, young people who live in poverty face major disadvantages. They are more likely to work as children, to never attend school or to drop out of it, to marry and bear children early. To reduce disparities among young people, it is urgent to focus on services that can make major differences in their lives. Declining fertility and improvements in child health have increased demand for schooling. Ensuring universal primary education and expanding enrollment at the secondary level can yield many dividends, especially with regard to improving skills for productive employment, reducing risky behaviors, and developing habits that can influence health for the rest of young people's lives. To reap the greatest benefits from education, both its length and contents are important. More than ever before, young people need not only be taught, but to be active participants in learning and to develop the behavioral skills that living in rapidly changing societies require. The adolescents and youth of today are central to realizing development that is sustainable and equitable. Greater investments in their education, health, and labor market opportunities can shape the well-being of tomorrow's adults, and in the process, ultimately narrow the gaps between countries with regard to human development. The present report provides a demographic overview of adolescents and youth, beginning with their numbers and shares of the working age population, because the absolute and the relative sizes of youth cohorts have consequences for the demands placed on public sector services and the supply of labor. The report also describes their family formation patterns, sexual and reproductive health, main causes of morbidity and mortality, and selected aspects of migration, and presents recommendations to improve outcomes for adolescents and youth in those key population-related areas. Population growth processes. Demographers track several population processes to estimate and project population change. For most of history and likely prehistory, the world's population change has been marked by high fertility rates, high crude birth rates, high infant mortality rates, high crude death rates, high mortality rates, and low life expectancy. When added together, this means that the world's population turned over rapidly, but absolute numbers grew only slightly and not at all. In demography, a relatively stable condition of no net decrease or increase in numbers is called a population replacement rate. By 1830, the global population had reached 1 billion. The second billion in population increase took only 100 years, the third billion about 30 years, the fourth billion 15 years, and the fifth billion only 12 years. Population Reference Bureau 2007. Figure 1 illustrates this exponential growth of world population since 1950, providing projections through the year 2050. By 2013, the world's population had reached approximately 7.1 billion, increasing by around 2.5 individuals per second. US Census Bureau 2013. Around 1990, we see the beginning of an downward trend in the overall population growth rate. The above graph shows the growth trend of population whereby it is depicted that in 1804 it was 1 billion, in 1999 it increased to 6 billion, and it is expected to increase to 9 billion in 2048, therefore showing a steep upward trend. However, as figure 1 shows, a decrease in the rate of population growth does not lead to a decrease in overall population. In absolute terms, the global population is projected to increase to over 9 billion people by 2050. According to the Population Reference Bureau, this increase is approximately the size of the combined population of China and India, the two most populous countries representing two of the highest population growth rates in the world in 2007. Factors affecting population growth. Obviously, genetical, biological, geographical and ecological factors affect population processes. One of the most well-known theories of population growth was put forth in 1798 by Robert Malthus, who held that the world's population would grow at a rate just slightly higher than the food production. Though natural population limiting processes exist, such as disease, drought and natural disasters, which lead to increase in the mortality rates, Malthus predicted a future in which widespread starvation would occur. Cultural and social factors also have had a tremendous impact on the population processes. It is no coincidence that the statistical techniques of demography become more sophisticated around the same time as the term sociology was coined by Auguste Comte. The two fields are complementary to one another, just as social change and population change go hand in hand. For example, the potential of war to dramatically affect population numbers cannot be overstated. If natural conditions produce widespread starvation, social conditions that spur conflict and war can arise. Demographic transition theory, a more recent and even better known theory of population growth, is known as a demographic transition theory, which holds that population move through 4 distinct stages of growth and decline processes linked to technological or developmental state of a given society. The first stage is the representative of most of the human history up until the last few centuries. According to demographic transition theory, stage 2 and 3 are periods of expected increase in overall population as societies undergo processes of industrialization and the accompanying changes in food supply, sanitation, medicine and working conditions. In stage 3, decreasing birth rates and increasing life expectancy begin a period of population decline. In stage 4, the birth rate can either stabilize or decrease. If birth rate are stable, the population again reaches the replacement rate. Demographic transition is descriptive of population growth during the era of widespread industrialization. Certainly, global population growth and decline have been geographically uneven and pattern do differ between more or less industrialized nations. Demographic transition theory will be put to the test as India and China, with the world's largest populations, continue to industrialize, and we see the outcomes of other recent trends in population processes over the next 40 years. Recent trends in population processes, fertility and contraception. Fertility rates in industrialized nations have been declining since the early 20th century. In many less industrialized countries, the idea of planning and timing children was quite revolutionary. Traditionally, with high rates of infant mortality, larger families held better chances of survival, gaining more status and wealth over time. During the latter part of the 20th century, attitudes towards childbearing began to change. The global fertility rates began to decline after 1960 as women in less industrialized countries began to limit the number of their children. Many factors contributed to the changes in the fertility patterns in the less industrialized world. Some studies credit organizations, family planning programs with at least half of the decline. Growing acceptance of the idea of family planning opened the doors to multiple changes in childbearing behavior. In the 1960s and 1970s, surveys to measure knowledge and use of family planning were first conducted in a small number of countries around the world. These surveys found that less than 10% of women were using any family planning method. Family planning programs worldwide began to introduce women to more effective pregnancy prevention methods, including female sterilization and oral contraceptives. Vasectomy or male sterilization is used by only about 4% of the worldwide population. By the 1980s, most women were using at least one effective method of contraception, and by 2000, more than half of the world's women of reproductive age were using some method of birth control. In less industrialized nations, the total fertility rate fell from 6.2% in the 1950s to around 3% in 2005. At that time, contraceptive use was higher in some less industrialized countries than in many European countries. A large body of research over the last several years links higher education for women and girls with reduction in fertility levels. Indeed, recent data from many countries show that women with at least a secondary level education eventually give birth to 1/3 to 1/2 fewer children than do women with no formal education whatsoever. Educated women tend to delay marriage and opt for more control over their reproductive lives. Sex ratios. Across countries and time periods, both the sex ratio at birth and the population sex ratio generally varies little between human populations. In 2013, just over half of the human population was male, with males accounted for 50.3% of the global total. In some areas of the world, the ratio of males to females is higher, while in other countries, including the United States, females outnumber males. Small variations do occur naturally, but reports began to appear in 1990s of 100 million or so missing women across the developing world. Cultural traditions of preference for sons are seen in almost all patrilineal societies, which link inheritance of property to the males in a family. However, there seems to be some evidence that son preference has distorted expected sex ratios in large parts of Asia and North Africa in particular. The contention is that son preference is now practiced actively in these countries through the increasing availability and use of sex-selective abortions and through discrimination in caregiving practices for girls, which leads to higher female mortality. Differential gender mortality in some areas has now been a documented problem for some time. Since the early 1990s, improved healthcare and conditions for women have resulted in reduction in female mortality. But these advances have now been offset by large numbers of surplus males now reaching adulthood. These males are predominantly of low socioeconomic class, and concerns have been expressed that their lack of marriageability and consequent marginalization in society may lead to antisocial behavior. Conclusion: the belief that population growth, especially in developing countries, is bad is the predominant view of the educated public. This proposition's widespread acceptance derives at least partially from its base in an incredible simple and powerful intuition. If there is a fixed amount of stuff, land, capital, saving, water, budget for education or whatever, then if there are some people to share the stuff, the average stuff per person must go down. In the face of this compelling line of reasoning, the more ambiguous and tenuous theory based on endogenous behavioral responses to population pressures and complicated econometric work never has a chance at persuasion. However, the evidence presented here suggests the basic premise is wrong. There is not a fixed amount of stuff. There is certainly not a fixed amount of capital stuff. Some countries have accumulated capital very rapidly while others have barely maintained or depreciated their existing stock. More specifically, there is no correlation between the rate of capital accumulation per worker and the rate of population growth. Both measures of capital suggest that in the developing countries, capital per worker grew more rapidly when population growth was rapid, although these estimates are small and statistically insignificant. The absolute physical capital growth was much more rapid in countries with rapid population growth, slightly more than the enough to offset the impact of more workers. I sincerely hope this lecture proves to be informative and enlightening for all the viewers. Thank you.